at the webinar hosted by BiteStreams about taking the first steps to become data-driven. I'm the host for today. I'm Jeroen van Putten. I'm involved at BiteStreams for over a year now almost, more involved in commercial activities. And I'm here with the co-founder of BiteStreams, Max. Max, could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. I'm Max. Good afternoon. I'm Max, co-founder and CEO of BiteStreams. Happy to be here and share a little bit of our thoughts on taking your first steps to become data-driven. BiteStreams as a company was originally, I had a long background in engineering, software, data, a lot of data, and I studied AI here in Amsterdam. And we saw that there is so much potential with data, but companies also talk a lot about being data-driven. I think everybody nowadays talks about opportunities with data, data-driven, but it's very much a buzzword, right? And that's also why we decided, hey, let's give this webinar, because we think that actually becoming data-driven is maybe a little bit more complicated than you might think. And you also see, if I would ask Jeroen or other companies, how data-driven are you really? On a scale of 1 to 10, you often see people maybe a frowning face and like, that's a difficult question. And a lot of people answer with a 6 or 7. And that often means, I'm actually not that data-driven. So let's get into it.
Cool. Small disclaimer. There are many topics to cover relating to being data-driven. And there's much more out there than just the stuff we will talk about. We really thought about, let's host this talk to inspire you guys to take the first steps to become data-driven, to know what it entails, to know where to think about. But like I already mentioned, there's much more out there. Okay. Give me half a second. This is not how it should go. Today we will talk roughly 20-25 minutes about taking your first steps. We will kick off with the value, and we end up with talking about the challenges of being data-driven. Many companies, you already mentioned, Max, talk about being data-driven. It's a really buzzword, but what does it actually entail to be data-driven?
So this is a very simple question, right? What does it mean to be data-driven? But like I was talking about, if you ask somebody, how data-driven are you? It's actually a little bit more complicated. So I think you could answer this question in several ways, but the main way we look at it is that being data-driven, especially as a company, it has all to do with the culture and the people in the business, and that they are in everything they do. So in day-to-day activities, you use data to gain insight, to use it for decision making. It should be a foundation for a lot of the things you do. It doesn't mean that data, it's not the only way, that you don't have to make every decision based on data. You should also use your own gut feeling, but you should use the numbers, right? If you have a discussion, you should start from somewhere, because otherwise, you're just a person with an opinion.
Yeah. And as you know, maybe the audience doesn't, I had an AI startup in the past. So I'm always curious, whenever I'm doing, what is the value of being data-driven? And I think that is something you also know more about.
Yeah. So let's get into it. So I alluded to it maybe already maybe a little bit, but I think you can summarize it really effectively by saying you can gain a better understanding of your business and its customers. So being data-driven has many aspects to it, but one that is often overlooked is better understanding your customers. So what we see with a lot of clients is that our clients at least, is that after becoming more data-driven, is that they communicate with their clients much more proactively. So, of course, when you're a startup and you have a few clients, you don't really need to do this, because you will often have a very good grip of whatever is going on inside your business. But once this starts growing from not 5 to 10, but maybe 20 to 50, as you grow, you get more and more challenges within your business, and a lot of these challenges can be tackled with data. And I think, just an example could be that if you have 50 customers, there might be 5 of them that have certain issues. They might not be, they might have a lot of open support tickets. They might not be onboarded quickly enough. They maybe the revenue compared to the potential revenue that they could be making from whatever service that you're offering is maybe much lower than expected. And these are the kind of things that they will be thinking about, but you also need to think ahead. And if you already see that happening in the data, you can contact them, right?
Yeah.
So let's move on to the next level. Sorry. We have decision making on a few levels. So this is more internally strategical, tactical, and operational. And in the end, this all leads to improved efficiency, but also better interaction with your customers.
Yeah, interesting. I think it's always important to look into some practical examples of companies successfully implementing data. We picked 5 companies I think we all know. Could you maybe elaborate on Nextbox with business intelligence?
Yeah, so we start of course with a case of our own. So Nextbox is a company that we have worked with for a long time, and we have helped them improve their business intelligence operation. And what that has meant for them specifically is a lot what I was just talking about is better interactivity with their customers. So you see that they are bringing insights on a market level, so to their customers. So if they're having a conversation with their customers, they can tell them, hey, your properties, so they do business in property rentals, in a property rental space, so you have properties in Spain. Hey, we're seeing these insights on the market level, you should be taking these steps, as an example. Then we go to bol.com. I think bol.com is, of course, very well known, but specifically on the product analytics level, you're seeing a lot of innovation nowadays. So for the people that don't know, Google Analytics, that's the basic step of product analytics, right? You might have a website, a landing page. Google Analytics will provide you analytics on what is going on in your product. But there's also, you can go much deeper. So there's products like, or companies, I should say, Mixpanel and Amplitude. They have very interesting analytics solutions that we also work with to integrate into your application. And it can be a mobile app, or I think a lot of companies nowadays are software companies. So this is really interesting. And I think bol.com has used this very effectively, as you see that they are conquering the market more and more.
Interesting. I think indeed every company is becoming a tech company, if you want it or not. A great example is also Check with data mining. Data mining is identifying patterns in huge sets of data. Check, of course, has a lot of data points regarding where are there mopeds, there scooters parked, but also where are the users opening the applications to assess, hey, where is a moped I could rent? And combining these data sets and finding out these patterns within the data could show, hey, how can I bring these mopeds closer to the actual users opening the phone, which would result in generating more money on renting out. Talking about making more money, I think data monetization is something at least we hear our clients talk a lot about. They're really interesting. How can I monetize the data I'm generating? Because a lot of companies have data. A great example is TomTom. Of course, we all know the company from the actual devices they have, but also the software they're selling to these car manufacturers. But besides selling the software and the actual hardware, they are also now selling the commute data, the travel data to municipalities, local governments to improve the infrastructure. So that is a great example of data monetization. And another really interesting example of Harley-Davidson and the branch which was located in New York is that they use advanced analytics in order to sell more motorcycles. What did they do? They identified what channels are most successful, email, social media, whatsoever, but also what characteristics of my ideal customer profile are there, which are selling or which have the biggest likelihood of purchasing a new motorcycle. Combining these data created a model in which they could assess, okay, these characteristics should be tackled on this way in order to generate sales. One example was, for example, that specific human should be reached out to with stating call now instead of buy now, for example, within an email, and that would increase sales with 400%. So they achieved great margins also on implementing some data use cases successfully. All these cases, Max, they all start with a foundation, with a technical foundation. Maybe that is something you can also elaborate on further.
Yeah. So I think this is of course super important. You have all these really interesting use cases like we were just talking about, but how do you actually get started? So I think the biggest pitfall, also to share some tips and tricks, right, and to share what not to do, is that a lot of companies do not establish a foundation. So a lot of companies, they start out with maybe one of their business people or one of their other hires has knowledge about business analysis or data science, and maybe they have a CTO, or maybe one of their management people knows a lot about Power BI, for example. And then a really easy way to get started is, hey, let's just open up Power BI and start building some reports and dashboards, because often, becoming data-driven often starts with, hey, just let's visualize the data. Let's start with that. And I think that's a really good approach. The only big challenge that we see, and that is often also how we come in as a company, is that in the end, you are building reports and insights on top of a foundation that is not there. So you might be integrating many Excel sheets or integrating with all kinds of databases, but those databases were not set up for analytics, right? And so you see quite some challenges there, because you invest maybe quite a bit, but in the end, the dashboards are not really usable. And we will talk a little bit more about why that could be the case, right? So what I'm alluding to here is that you need to establish a single source of truth. And it's a little bit of a buzzword, but I will explain what it is. The three components to do this is a data pipeline. So you need to gather all the important data for your first use case, right? So think about the use case that you want to solve in terms of analytics, gather the data and bring it into one central location, which is the single source of truth, the data warehouse. And then you can only then you can really start doing analytics properly, at least in our vision. So let's take a look at this data warehouse. It's a really central piece. What is it? I've written some content about this before, so definitely check out our website if you want to know more about this, but I will briefly touch on the topic now. What is a data warehouse? It's conceptually very simple. It's all your data under one roof. So you create a central location where your sales data, your marketing data, but also all your customer data is all gathered in one place, which is suitable for analytics. So you can analyze different things against each other, where previously maybe this was very difficult. And also what is really important about this step is that in the data warehouse, you have done the process of building a data pipeline. And in that pipeline, one of the most important things is that you create high quality data. So all the data, all the fields are properly filled in, and there's no rubbish in there, if I can call it that. Once you have all this data together, you can also do something like data mining. And I think that's maybe a topic for another time, but that is interesting, where you can start to analyze data that first was not co-located. Once you have maybe your analytics, so your marketing and your sales data, you can also really start to look at, hey, this marketing campaign, how is it performing down the road in towards the sales? So there's a few cloud options. I listed them here. I will not talk about it, but I think these are really good options to look at if you're just getting started. Snowflake is the more general option, but also a little bit more expensive, I would like to add. Let's continue.
Cool.
So once you get started with the data warehouse, I think there's still a big question of like, okay, a data warehouse, but who's going to build this, right? So, I mean, there's all these different things I need to know. How do I really get started? So this is also a people problem and maybe a skills problem. And how we look at it is that you really need to cover 3 bases. And if you've covered these 3 bases, that means you can really get started properly. That is data science, business analysis, and data engineering. So we see that a lot of data analytics practices, if I can call them that, fail because they start out with one of the 3 only. And yeah, what that means is you will run into a lot of the problems that I mentioned. So you need to think about, how am I going to approach this, and do I have all my bases covered, basically.
Cool. And if I'm really honest, you'd say, hey, I see some problems arising when companies only have one out of the three. Let's assume I'm a company, I have 50 or 40 employees, and I want to start to really become data driven. Do I immediately have to hire 3 FTE for this, or how should I tackle this?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. What we see a lot with the companies that we help out, of course, is that even as they're quite big, maybe 50, 60 people and up, they don't need a full-time data role. So it's not, I think data analytics and data practice, or building a data foundation and becoming data driven, you don't necessarily need to start out with a team of 3 people and data ambassadors, and there are so many roles nowadays, which makes it also very complicated. You just need to start out with these 3 bases. So make sure that if you hire somebody or outsource something, that you have these 3 bases covered, but you don't necessarily need to start hiring many people, because also you need to think about the business use case and the ROI.
Yeah,
of course.
I think BI is something a lot of companies know a lot about. Business intelligence, you hear it a lot, and some companies also start with dashboards. A lot of software tools have embedded or have dashboards with it. But something we see, unfortunately, also very often is many organizations that they have a lot of dashboards, a lot of reports, which are not being used. And why are they being used? Because they aren't actionable. So I think that's also an interesting topic to touch upon for today. But first off, the value of dashboarding. How valuable is BI at the end of the day?
So what we actually often encounter, and it's a little bit funny actually, because it's quite counterintuitive. Also, it was counterintuitive for us when we just started out, because what happened is that we got into conversations with a lot of companies, and what we realized often is that they want to go for the, how do you say this, to the top of the iceberg. They want to go to AI. They want to maybe prove their business case, prove the ROI. But what often is happening is actually that the whole company is not data driven yet, because they're missing insights and the data quality is not there. So the advantages of dashboarding are paramount, I would say, because they are really the foundation to becoming data driven. Once everyone is looking at the data daily, that's really how the interaction starts, and how the data starts living within an organization, I would say. So you get a clear overview, what is happening. People are more aware of, hey, where are we dropping the ball? But also, where are we having a lot of benefits? Or are we doing a really good job, I should say. Your decision-making will become better and faster. So there will be less discussions about things that are already clear in the data. And also there is less overhead, right? Because everyone can figure out for themselves, hey, what is it I should be focusing on, especially if you have clear KPIs set for all of your personnel.
Yeah. Before deep diving in how to make data more actionable, Bart, we see your question coming in. We will answer that at the end of the webinar. How to make data actionable. First of all, that's something we got asked a lot about. How do I make these dashboards actionable? How do I make these reports actionable? And I think it's not that difficult, but you just have to know some of the basics. I think Sheffer 4 C's of data visualization is a very interesting source. Feel free to look it up. It's about clear, concise. It really gives you some good handles to work on. I think also benchmarking and drill down functions are extremely important, but let's deep dive into it according to an example. This is, for example, a dashboard. And what we see as really important for dashboards is, first of all, the reasons of having a dashboard. People are visually oriented. You remind stuff better the moment you actually see it. But also balance aesthetics with the data you're actually showing. Don't put too many numbers on there, but also not too few. Don't use too many colors, also not too few. It's always a balance. And how to find out what that balance actually is sitting down with the end users, to whom or who should use this dashboard, and also how often should this dashboard be used. If you create a dashboard which should be assessed weekly, daily, monthly, you need different characteristics than if a dashboard is being used here. This dashboard, for example, is for sales representatives. In my opinion, it has some really good perks, but also some less good perks to mention it like this. For example, you see on the left, you see quite some KPIs, email send out, etc., etc. But also, to what am I comparing these details? If this is something management is seeing once a month, then you maybe want to see what is the delta. So I see here minus 27%, for example, compared to what? The same month last year, last month, etc., etc. That should be really clear, because if you want dashboards to be used, make sure that in one blink of an eye, you can see, okay, this is where it's for, and this is to whom it should be used. So I think that is really important. Besides that, Max, you are the expert here. If you look at this dashboard, what are some other things to improve?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think this dashboard is already quite good, but it's failing in some particular points. So if you look on the right-hand side at the bar graphs, I think they add quite little value, where it would be quite easy to add a lot more value. So, for example, something that we almost always do is that when you show a graph like this, you always want to compare or add a comparison. You want to add the benchmark. So I see some bars there, and they don't even have labels. So that's the first thing, right? So make it much more clear, hey, which date is which. I see it's very minimal, but it's too minimal. So getting the balance right is really difficult. But also, when you look at a specific date, just the number doesn't say anything. So data itself is not interesting. You need to analyze it. And how do we do that? Well, the first step would be compare it to the same number, do the benchmark, of course. And then the second step would also be, are there segments in this? So I don't see any filters. Were there more sales with certain kinds of calls or certain kinds of emails or certain kinds of email setups? Of course, there's so many questions that I have when I look at this. And of course, they could be hidden away. So it's just an example. But
Two things I would like to add. First of all, the drill down function. I think we briefly mentioned it, but I want to touch upon it again. What is really important is that you have different layers within organizations, and therefore also different layers in a dashboard or in a report, depending, of course. And what you want is you want to first create this overview of, okay, how are my sales teams behaving compared to the same period last year, for example. But then you want to drill down, click on it, and see, okay, how are my sales teams behaving in specific regions or in specific countries or in specific times of the week whatsoever. And then you want to drill down to specific account representatives to see how are they performing compared to last month. Because when you have these drill down functions, you can put your finger on, hey, what's the reason behind the reason that we have fewer sales this month compared to last month, for example. And one small test we sometimes do is if you send out a dashboard or a report to the actual user and they don't have to ask any questions, that is also when you master the process. The moment they see straight away, hey, this is for me, and this is intuitive, then you know it's good. If you get back a lot of questions, what is this, what's that, then you also know that you're on the wrong side of the table. The challenges, I think we're getting to the end of the show, the end of the webinar. Every process, every business, everything has its own challenges, also becoming data-driven. You already briefly touched upon the fact that culture is a very important aspect. I fully agree. I think what we see also from our customers, if I look at our successful implementations, you really see that culture starts from the top. C-level, C-suite, they have to think, okay, data-driven, that's the way to go. Because they have to also brief almost being data-driven. Because you should allow employees to have the tools to become data-driven. It should be implemented in their way of working. Meetings should be scheduled weekly, monthly, quarterly to assess the data. So it's really also an operational or a C-level decision which should flow within the organization. Working with data also means that you should be transparent with the data. If you want decisions to be made based on data, also allow people to see that data. Otherwise, it will never work. Also, don't accept ignorance is something we see as very important. If individuals say, oh, I'm not data-driven, I don't know how to generate data, clean up data, assess data, work with data, and I don't want to, that is very difficult. Of course, allow training, give them also the training that they're able to work with data, but don't allow individuals who are just ignorant on the topic. And also keep in mind that working with data is change management. You're implementing new tools, new technologies. That doesn't go overnight. So put your time and effort into the topic. But besides culture, I think there's much more. Max, could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so I think there's so many topics that I could talk about right now, but I think I will touch on two things that I think are super important, and I think that we see going wrong all the time. So a lot of the time when we help out our clients or when we enter our first initial conversations, what we often discover is that there is a lot of technical debt. So this is, of course, a term from software development as well, but actually in data, I think it might be an even bigger problem. But people are just not as aware of how problematic this is. So technical debt will show itself in two ways. One is the quality of the data. So if the quality of the data is not good, none of the data solutions will be usable. Two is that if the whole data approach, basically, as I like to call it, or data landscape, if it's not managed correctly, you get a lot of different scripts and all kinds of implementations, and people are building things for today, but they're not thinking about the long term. And what that means often is that, just like software solutions, if you're building the legacy code of tomorrow, that means also next year you're going to have a conversation about, hey, do we need to build everything all over again? And that's just a huge waste. Secondly, this also has a lot to do with skills, right? So like I was mentioning, you need, for actually to be successful with your data practice, you need a lot of different skills. You need skills around UI, UX. You need to create actionable dashboards, but you also need to know about how do I build a data pipeline. You need to know about data science. How do I interpret data? How do I see, what kind of really interesting use cases are there for this business? So you really need to look into, hey, what is right for us? And there is also a level of business understanding that you need. So it's just hiring technical people is also not the answer, because you really need to understand, hey, how does the business work and what processes are there that we could identify where we could have achieved great results, basically. And then last but not least, privacy and ethics. I think it's one we definitely couldn't skip, because I also see this going wrong. We see a lot of dashboards being shared with customers with open links, basically, or I'm not sure how to call it, but it's where privacy or the data, if the data is shared in a really unprofessional way, I would say, you risk that customers can see the data of each other, lawsuits, personal identifiable information. There's a lot to consider when you look at privacy and ethics of your data.
Yeah.
So
something to keep in mind.
Yeah.
One question for you, Max. It's a good one. Bart, thank you. Max, what key insights have you gained regarding the long-term upkeep of your data pipelines? For instance, you may have initially designed them to function at a specific moment, but source systems may undergo schema changes or even complete replacements over time. Have you encountered difficulties when it comes to sustaining pre-existing solutions?
Yeah, so I think those are two questions. Let's start with maintenance over time. So I think this is a little bit about what I was talking about, designing for the long term. So you definitely need to consider, hey, what solutions are we going to use to build our data pipelines, right? So just the other day, we were talking to a customer that was using a proprietary implementation. And in the end, after having invested for years, you also see that this bites them in the end, because if you ever want to change, you're in a dire situation. I think what Bart is also alluding to is that data pipelines can also be, depending on how you design them, they can also be brittle. So you need to have data contracts in place. I think there are some people that are writing a lot about these lately, is that basically you need to, data solutions are not just a technical thing. You can't just put a team and put them in a corner somewhere and they're going to build great things. No, they really need to talk to the business, but they also need to talk to the other people, the other engineers in the business, because the data is generated somewhere. And if something changes on that end, you also need to incorporate that on the data side. And yeah, a lot of companies are not yet mature enough, or they don't know yet enough about data to account for all the things that could go wrong. So I think it's a great question. It's one that deserves, I think, a personal touch for every company.
Yeah, cool, interesting. Bart, thank you. If there are any other questions relating to the topic, feel free to reach out to Max or myself. We would like to thank you for being present. At least I really enjoyed it, and I think you as well, Max. Yeah, like I mentioned, you could reach out for any questions on phone or email. And for now, yeah, we would like to see you next time. But keep in mind, on this topic, there's much more to read, to see, to listen, to talk about. So yeah, the things we covered here should more function as inspiration. And we see each other in the future. Thank you.